My name is Helen Moore. That year, I was 68 years old. I lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of Oregon, where I had lived for more than 30 years, since the days when my husband was still alive. The house wasn't large or new, but every corner was filled with memories. That afternoon, the air was tranquil. I had just finished watering the flower pots on the porch when I heard a car pull up. When I looked up, I saw my daughter-in-law, Laura, standing at the gate. Beside her was a well-dressed man holding a leather briefcase, his manner polite and professional. Laura had married my son just 1 week earlier. She smiled, a light smile but not a warm one. "Mom, this is Mark. He works as a notary. We stopped by to help you review some of the house paperwork." I froze for a few seconds. I didn't remember asking anyone to review any documents. I also didn't understand why it needed to be done so urgently, right after the wedding. The man nodded at me, his voice courteous but carrying a hint of haste. "It's just a routine check, ma'am. It won't take much time." I felt my heart beating faster than usual, not out of fear, but because of a feeling I couldn't quite name, as if something wasn't right, though I couldn't yet put my finger on it. I looked at Laura. She avoided my eyes almost immediately. Still, I opened the door and invited them in. I was used to trusting people, especially family. I made tea, placed the cups on the table, and sat down in the chair across from them. The man opened his briefcase and took out a thick stack of papers. He arranged them neatly in front of me, as though he had done this many times before. Laura sat beside me. She began talking about very gentle things, that the house was old, that organizing the paperwork would give me peace of mind in the future, that everything was for my own good. I listened, but one question kept repeating in my mind. Why now? I lowered my gaze to the stack of documents on the table. So many pages, so much small print, so many lines I hadn't had time to read. I suddenly realized that, in my own familiar living room, I was the only person who didn't honestly know what was going on. But there was one thing they didn't know. In the months leading up to that afternoon, I had quietly prepared for a day like this. I had never told my son, and I, indeed, had never told Laura. I placed my hand on the papers and took a deep breath. And that was the moment everything began to turn in a different direction. If you have ever witnessed family conflicts unfolding in silence, where no one raises their voice, yet everyone is hurting, this story may feel familiar. If you believe that older people deserve to be heard, respected, and allowed to make decisions about their own lives, stay with this channel. We tell real-life stories slowly and honestly, not to judge but to understand, to protect families through healthy boundaries and mutual respect. If these values matter to you, consider subscribing to walk with our community through the stories to come. 3 months before that quiet afternoon, my life was still moving along at a familiar pace. Every morning I woke up early, brewed a pot of tea, and opened the windows to let sunlight into the kitchen. I was no longer working, but I kept my habits tidy and my meals proper, just as I had when my husband was alive, and Daniel still lived at home. That day was a Saturday morning. I was wiping down the kitchen table when the phone rang. It was Daniel. My son's voice came through, slightly nervous but clearly happy. "Mom, I want to tell you something. Laura and I are planning to get married." I stood still for a few seconds, the dishcloth still in my hand. Then I laughed, a soft laugh, full of emotion. I had known this day would come, but hearing him say it himself still warmed my heart in a way I hadn't expected. "That's wonderful," I said. "I'm so happy for you both." Daniel went on to share a few more details. The wedding wouldn't be too big. Laura preferred things to be neat and straightforward. They planned to live nearby, not too far from my house. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long while. I thought of Daniel as a little boy, running around the house, always asking questions. I thought of the years when it was just the two of us, leaning on each other after my husband passed away. I had always hoped my son would have a family of his own, a partner to share life with, and now that hope was about to come true. That afternoon, I changed into my clothes, grabbed my bag, and headed to the market. I wanted to prepare a proper meal for the day Daniel would bring Laura home to meet me. I chose everything carefully. The vegetables had to be fresh. The meat is just right. I even bought a few dishes Daniel had loved since childhood, even though he hadn't eaten them often in recent years. On the way home, I imagined many things. I pictured Laura stepping into the kitchen, me asking whether she liked to cook. I imagined sharing family recipes with her, dishes Daniel often mentioned whenever he felt homesick. I imagined afternoons filled with the sound of children running around the yard, calling me Grandma. Those thoughts made me feel young again. On the day Daniel and Laura came over, I woke up earlier than usual. I straightened the living room, wiped every surface, and changed the tablecloth. I cooked the braised meat Daniel loved, a dish I had made for years when he was still in school. I added a simple vegetable dish and a baked dessert. When everything was ready, I changed into the blouse I saved for special occasions. I stood in front of the mirror and brushed my hair. I wasn't trying to look younger, just neat and presentable. Daniel arrived first, followed by Laura. She looked very polished, from her hair to her clothes. I smiled and stepped forward to greet them, my heart full of hope. I didn't expect much. I only hoped I could be part of my son's new life, not to interfere, not to control, just to be there when needed, as I always had been. During the meal, I noticed Daniel ate well. He ate the same way he had as a child, only speaking less, perhaps out of shyness. That seemed perfectly normal to me. Young people in love are often like that. I looked at Laura and reminded myself to be patient. Not everyone opens up easily at first. I believed that time would take care of the rest. With more shared meals, more visits, things would change. That evening, after the two of them left, I cleaned up on my own. The warmth was still there inside me. I sat at the kitchen table and finished a cup of tea that had gone cold. I thought to myself how fortunate I was. My son had grown up and found a companion. I believed our family was entering a new chapter, calm, steady, and full of hope. At that time, I had no idea that from those very ordinary expectations, something far more complicated was quietly beginning. The first meeting went more smoothly than I had expected, but it also left me with a strange sense of unease. It wasn't disappointment, just a faint sense of emptiness, like when you wait for an answer and the other person only smiles. Laura always maintained a polite manner. She greeted me properly, thanked me when I placed food in front of her, and nodded when Daniel pointed out small memories around the house. But beyond that, she hardly spoke. Whenever I asked her something, Laura answered very briefly, "Yes, ma'am. It's fine. I'm a bit busy." Her tone wasn't unpleasant. It simply didn't invite the conversation to go any further. I tried asking about her job, where she grew up, and her everyday interests, but every answer ended quickly, as if she didn't want to go beyond what was necessary. I told myself that perhaps young people today are used to keeping their distance. Perhaps she was just shy. While Daniel was talking, I noticed Laura looking around the house. She wasn't just glancing. She looked carefully. Her eyes lingered on each corner, each shelf, each photograph on the wall. At one point, I caught her staring at the wedding photo of my husband and me for quite a while, then turning away quickly when she noticed me looking. I didn't think much of it. This house was familiar to me, but to an outsider, it might just seem like an old home filled with the belongings of an older person. I didn't see anything worth worrying about. During the meal, Laura ate very little. She picked at her food, eating slowly and carefully. When I asked if she wanted more, she smiled and said, "No, thank you, Mom." Her voice was still gentle, but there was no warmth in it. Daniel was different. He ate as if he hadn't had a home-cooked meal in a long time. Watching him eat, I felt my heart soften. I thought that at least my son still felt comfortable here. After the meal, Laura sat on the sofa with her back straight, her hands neatly folded in her lap. She checked her phone a few times, then put it away. She didn't ask anything about the house, nor did she ask whether I felt lonely living alone. She simply sat there, like a guest waiting for the right moment to leave. I blamed myself for overthinking. Not everyone is used to chatting with older people. Not everyone expresses their feelings readily. When they stood up to leave, Laura thanked me once again for the meal. She spoke politely. I nodded, smiled, and wished them a safe trip home. After closing the door, I stood still in the living room for a while. I wasn't deeply sad, just slightly deflated, like when you expect a hug but receive only a handshake. That evening, I cleaned the kitchen as usual. I put the dishes away, wiped the table, and then sat down. I told myself I needed to be patient. Young people have their own lives, their own work, their own rhythm. I couldn't expect my daughter-in-law to be the same as I had been in the past. I thought that things would change once we got to know each other better, with more time. When the initial distance faded, at that point, I still believed those minor signs meant nothing serious. I believed it was simply a generational difference, nothing more. I didn't know that from those minimal distances, a much larger gap was quietly forming. The weeks before the wedding passed more quickly than I had expected. I thought I would be involved in at least a few small things, or at the very least be asked for my opinion. But reality was different. Every decision came from Laura. I didn't learn this directly, but through things Daniel mentioned casually. The decoration colors had already been chosen. The venue was booked. The guest list was finalized. Even the menu had been decided. Daniel talked about it all very calmly, as if everything was naturally supposed to be that way. I listened, nodded, and didn't ask much. I didn't want my son to feel that I was interfering. One time, when Daniel stopped by, I gathered my courage and asked, "Is there anything I can help with for the wedding?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, then said, "Laura wants everything to be simple. She's already arranged almost everything." I understood. I smiled and said it was fine. But inside, something sank. Not because I wanted control, but because I wanted to be part of an essential event in my son's life. I thought I could at least make the wedding cake. Our family had that tradition. My mother had made the cake for my wedding. I had baked for many vital moments in Daniel's life. The cakes were never elaborate, but they always carried a familiar family flavor. One afternoon, when Laura and Daniel came over, I brought it up. "If you don't mind, I could make the wedding cake." Laura looked at me and smiled very lightly. The smile wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't warm either. "I think it would be more convenient to have a bakery do it, Mom. They're more professional." The words were gentle. There was no criticism, no condescension. But I understood. My offer had been declined. Daniel looked at me, then at Laura. He didn't say anything else. That evening, after they left, I sat alone in the kitchen. I looked at the apron hanging on its hook, the apron I always wore when baking. I remembered Daniel as a little boy, standing by the counter, eagerly waiting for the cake to be done. I remembered the smell of butter, sugar, and flour when the kitchen was still filled with laughter. I sat there for a long time, doing nothing, just sitting and thinking. When did the things I used to do for my family become unnecessary? No one said it out loud, but I could feel it. The conversations about the wedding grew fewer and fewer. Daniel still stopped by, but only to pick up things or talk briefly. Laura rarely came with him. When she did, she was always in a hurry, always had a reason to leave early. I was no longer asked for input on anything. I only listened and stayed silent. Some evenings, I would sit in the kitchen and turn the light on later than usual. I made a cup of tea and looked around the familiar room. I wondered what I had done wrong, or whether I simply was no longer needed in the new decisions of my son's life. I tried to comfort myself. Young people have their own lives. A wedding belongs to the couple. Maybe I was being too sensitive, but the feeling of being pushed aside, even if very subtle, was still there, like an empty chair in a crowded room. I still believed things would be better after the wedding. I believed that once everything settled, once Laura was no longer under the pressure of preparation, we would have a chance to understand each other better. I didn't know that what I was experiencing was only the beginning. Daniel's wedding day arrived faster than I expected. That morning, I woke up very early. I chose the dress I had bought a few weeks earlier, subtle in color, not too eye-catching. I didn't want to stand out. I just wanted to look appropriate on such an important day for my son. I did my own hair and applied light makeup. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw an older woman still trying to put herself together well. I told myself that today was a happy day. Everything else, I would set aside. I arrived at the wedding venue early. I had always had the habit of arriving ahead of time, so as not to inconvenience anyone. When I walked in, I looked around for my seat. A young woman from the event staff smiled politely and pointed toward the back. "Your seat is in this row, ma'am." I followed where she pointed. When I sat down, I realized I was pretty far from the aisle. In front of me were people I didn't recognize. I turned around and saw that the front rows were filled with Laura's family, her friends, people I had never met. I swallowed lightly and told myself it was fine. A seat was just a seat. When Daniel walked in, my heart tightened. I had to lean to one side just to see him clearly. I raised my hand slightly, but Daniel didn't notice. The ceremony went by quickly. People clapped and smiled. I clapped and smiled too, but something inside me felt heavy. I wondered whether anyone noticed that the groom's mother was sitting so far away. When it was time for the reception, everyone moved into the next room. I stood still for a few seconds, then followed the crowd. I looked for my name on the tables and finally found it tucked away in a somewhat hidden corner. I sat down, placed my purse beside me, and tried to keep a calm expression. Laura introduced me to a few people. "This is Daniel's mother. She's a great cook." She smiled. People nodded politely. No one asked my name. I wasn't introduced as the mother-in-law, nor was I given any role beyond that brief sentence. When it came time for speeches, I had prepared a few words in my head. I hadn't written anything down. I simply planned to say a few lines wishing my son and daughter-in-law happiness. I sat and waited, listening as one person after another spoke. Laura's parents spoke, Laura's friends spoke, even Laura's co-workers had their turn. Finally, the host looked in my direction. Laura turned toward me and gave a slight nod. Daniel's mother may say a few brief words. I stood up. My hands trembled slightly, but I took a deep breath. I had just managed to say 2 sentences when applause broke out, not because I had finished, but because someone started clapping early. The applause spread quickly, drowning out my voice. I sat back down. I didn't say anything else. During the reception, Daniel danced with Laura, then danced with Laura's mother. I watched from a distance. I thought maybe he would come back. But one song ended. Another began, and Daniel still didn't look in my direction. An acquaintance came over and asked, quietly, "Hasn't Daniel danced with you yet?" I smiled and said he was busy. Near the end of the reception, I felt I no longer had the strength to keep sitting there. I stood up and looked for Daniel. I lightly touched his arm. "I'm going to head home now." Daniel hugged me very quickly. "Thank you for coming, Mom." Laura stood beside him. "Thank you, Mom." Her voice was gentle, but there was nothing in it that asked me to stay. As I walked out, I heard Laura speaking softly to a few friends. "Good thing his mother doesn't live nearby." They laughed quietly. I kept walking and didn't turn back. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and placed both hands on the steering wheel. For the first time that day, I let the tears fall. That evening, when I got home, I slipped off my shoes at the door, walked into the kitchen, and turned on the light. The house was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I sat down in a chair, and for the first time I admitted to myself that something had truly changed. After the wedding, I thought things would eventually soften. I believed that once the busyness passed, Daniel would call me more often like before. But days passed, then weeks, and my phone remained silent. I was the one who made the first call. On the first call after the wedding, Daniel answered pretty quickly. He said they were busy settling the house, handling paperwork, and that he would call back later. I said it was fine, that I was just checking in. The call ended very quickly. On the second call, Daniel sounded tired. "I'm fine, Mom. Laura sends her regards. I'll call you another day, okay?" I placed the phone on the table and watched the screen go dark. I wasn't angry. I just felt empty. After nearly 2 weeks without seeing him, I decided to bake. A simple batch of cookies, something Daniel had loved since he was little. I told myself I would just stop by briefly, drop them off, and leave. No inconvenience. I changed into neat clothes, tied a small ribbon around the box of cookies, and drove to their new house. On the way, I imagined Daniel opening the door, smiling, asking how I had been. I thought maybe things would feel different in person. Laura opened the door. She looked very put together, as if always ready for someone to look in on her. "Oh, Mom, you're here." I held up the box. "I made cookies for Daniel." Laura took it, looked inside, and nodded. "Thank you, Mom. Daniel is in a meeting." I stood right at the doorway. I waited for an invitation to come in, but none came. Laura had already closed the door halfway, as if the visit was over. "Thanks, Mom. Drive safely." The door closed. I stood there for a few seconds, then turned away. When I sat in the car, I had to grip the steering wheel tightly to stay composed. I didn't cry right away. I just felt my heart grow heavier. That evening, I ate dinner alone. I turned on the television, but couldn't really hear what was playing. After cleaning up, I sat in the living room, turned off all the lights except for the small table lamp. The house felt larger than usual, quieter than usual. I went into the bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept a few of my husband's belongings. I took out his old watch, the one he wore every day. I remembered evenings when he sat at the kitchen table and told me that when children grow up, parents must learn to step back, but that doesn't mean being forgotten. Before he passed away, he once held my hand and said, "If there ever comes a time when you feel you're no longer being listened to, don't stay silent for too long. You deserve respect." I hadn't fully understood those words back then, but that night, sitting alone in my familiar house, I began to understand. Not all silence is peaceful. Some silences slowly make a person disappear within their own family. I lay down on the bed staring at the ceiling in the dark. I thought about Daniel, about the son who used to run to me whenever he was upset. I wondered when the distance between us had become so painfully clear. That night, it took me a long time to fall asleep, and when I finally closed my eyes, I knew I was standing at the edge of a chapter I had never imagined I would have to face: the loneliness of being a mother who no longer feels included. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. The house was still quiet, but something inside me felt different. I no longer felt as sad as I had the night before. Instead, there was an emptiness accompanied by thoughts that kept circling endlessly. I made coffee, carried the mug into the living room, and sat down in the chair by the window. Sunlight spilt across the floor, just like on any other morning. But I knew something inside me was changing. I thought about what my husband had said the night before. I remembered the words he had repeated many times before he passed away. "You have to know what you hold in your hands." I stood up and walked toward the bedroom. In the corner of the closet was a small safe. I hadn't opened it in a long time, not because I had forgotten about it, but because I no longer felt the need to pay attention to those papers. I believed everything had been settled long ago. I opened the safe. Inside were familiar documents: our marriage certificate, property papers, insurance policies, and a few old files yellowed with age. I flipped through each folder slowly, as if rereading my own life. Near the bottom of the safe, I found a thick envelope labeled in my husband's handwriting. I paused for a few seconds, then opened it. Inside were documents related to a piece of agricultural land in the eastern part of the state. It wasn't large, and it wasn't in any special location, but it was land my husband had purchased many years earlier, set aside for the future. I remembered him mentioning it, though I had never really paid attention. I read each page carefully. The land was in my name, completely legal. Its value wasn't a number that would shock anyone, but it was enough for me to live independently, enough that I wouldn't have to rely on anyone if I didn't want to. I sat down on the bed, resting the papers on my lap. My heart beat faster, not because of the money, but because of a very unfamiliar feeling, the feeling that I still had choices. All this time, I had unknowingly forgotten that. I had grown accustomed to prioritizing my son and the stability of our family to the point where I no longer remembered that I, too, had my own life and future. I wasn't someone who had nothing to offer. I was simply someone who had grown accustomed to not using what she had. I gathered the documents, placed the envelope back in the safe, and locked it carefully. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't tell anyone. Even Margaret, my closest friend, didn't know at that point. I chose to remain silent, not out of fear, but because I needed time to think. I needed to understand clearly where I stood and what I wanted. I needed to observe more, listen more, before making any decisions. That. After noon, I went out to the garden and watered the plants as usual. Everything outside remained ordinary. But inside me, something significant had changed. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely powerless. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I would no longer let anyone make decisions for me, at least not while I was still clear-minded enough to understand and choose for myself. And so I stayed silent. But it was no longer a weak silence. It was a deliberate one, held until I knew exactly what needed to be said and to whom. A few days after I opened the safe, my phone began ringing more often, not from Daniel, but from Laura. The first call came one morning. Laura's voice was gentle, even warmer than it had been before. "How have you been lately, Mom? I just wanted to check in on you." I answered normally. I said I was fine, going about my daily routine as usual. Laura listened, occasionally responding with polite remarks. Then she shifted the conversation, as if that had been her real reason for calling. "Is it hard living alone in that house? It's a bit old now. Cleaning it must be tiring." I replied that I was used to it. I had lived there for many years. Laura laughed softly over the phone. "I'm just worried about you. At this age, doing too much isn't good." I was silent for a few seconds. She continued, her voice still very gentle. "Have you ever thought about selling the house? Moving somewhere smaller would be more convenient." The suggestion came so naturally, like a harmless idea. But something inside me sank slightly. I remembered the stack of documents from before and the unease I had felt when Laura showed up with the notary. I told her I hadn't thought about it. The house held many memories. Laura didn't push. She simply said, "Take your time to think about it. Daniel and I just want you to be more comfortable." The call ended calmly, but after I put the phone down, I sat still for a long time. I began paying attention to every word, not out of suspicion, but because I didn't want to miss anything. A few days later, Laura called again. This time, she talked more. She spoke about her work, about arranging the house, then steered the conversation back to me. "Have you been feeling tired lately? A lot of people your age start forgetting things." I answered that my memory was still quite good. Laura laughed. "I know, but there are places that take very good care of older people. Doctors, group activities. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." I tightened my grip on the phone. For the first time, I felt that her words were no longer just concerned. They were genuine. I asked calmly, "Why do you think I need a place like that?" Laura replied quickly, "I'm just thinking ahead, just in case." After that call, Daniel came to my house. For the first time since the wedding, he stopped by without calling ahead. He sat down on the sofa, looking tense. "Mom, Laura and I have been talking a lot about your future." I looked at my son. He avoided my eyes, just like he did when he was little and unsure whether what he was doing was right. Daniel continued, his voice slow and steady. "This house is a bit big for you, and you're not young anymore. Laura thinks selling it and moving somewhere else would be better. I didn't respond right away. I let him finish. Daniel repeated almost word for word what Laura had said on the phone about the old house, about fatigue, about professional care facilities. Each sentence sounded reasonable, carefully framed, but when I put them all together, I began to see a different picture. I asked him softly, "Is that your idea, or Laura's?" Daniel was silent. Then he said, "We're just worried about you." That answer didn't reassure me. On the contrary, it made me more alert. I didn't argue. I didn't object. I simply said that I needed time to think. Daniel nodded, as if he had already expected that response. Before leaving, he hugged me. A quick hug, not tight. After he left, I sat alone in the living room. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry. I just began replaying every sentence, every phone call, every time Laura's eyes had wandered around the house. I realized that nothing happened all at once. It came little by little, very slowly, like someone testing to see how I would react. That evening, I took out a small notebook and placed it on the kitchen table. I didn't write much, just a few short lines. Dates, times, who said what, and in what context. I didn't know if I would ever need it, but I knew that from this point on, I needed to remember clearly, not to confront anyone, but to protect myself. I remained silent, but inside me, that silence now carried an entirely different meaning. After Laura's phone calls and Daniel's visit, I no longer felt as at ease as before. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew I shouldn't face this alone. The first person who came to mind was Margaret. Margaret has been my friend for more than 40 years. We met when our children were still young, went grocery shopping together, took turns driving the kids to school, and later supported each other through the difficult years after my husband passed away. She is straightforward, never evasive, and most importantly, she has no reason to take advantage of me. I called Margaret one afternoon. As soon as she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. "Helen, what's going on? You don't sound like yourself." I didn't tell her everything right away. I simply said I was confused, that Daniel and Laura wanted me to sell the house, and that they kept talking about how I might no longer be capable of taking care of myself. Margaret listened quietly until I finished. Then she sighed. "You're not imagining things, Helen. This happens more often than you think." Margaret told me about someone she knew who had been in a similar situation. The children and relatives had started with concern, then gradually guided the older person into handing over financial control. Everything sounded reasonable. Everything was polite. "You need to talk to a lawyer," Margaret said. "Not to make a big deal out of it, but to know exactly where you stand." The next day, Margaret drove over to pick me up. We went to see Thomas Reed, a lawyer she trusted. His office was in a small, unassuming building. Thomas was a middle-aged man who spoke calmly, with serious eyes that didn't feel distant. I told him everything, from Laura's calls, to the suggestions about selling the house, to Daniel repeating his wife's words. I also told him about the piece of land my husband had left me. Thomas listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded. "What you're describing is a form of financial manipulation targeting older adults. It often begins by making you doubt your own abilities, then offering solutions that place control in someone else's hands." I asked him, unable to hide my concern, "So what should I do?" Thomas answered clearly. "First, do not sign any documents without independent legal advice. Second, keep a record of every conversation related to your assets. And third, put a legal plan in place to protect what belongs to you." We stayed a while longer, discussing specific steps to take, not to confront anyone immediately, but to be prepared if things worsen. Thomas helped me understand that protecting myself did not mean I didn't love my family. It was a way to keep relationships from crossing dangerous boundaries. When we left the lawyer's office, I felt a sense of relief, not because everything had been resolved, but because I knew I was no longer alone. Margaret squeezed my hand in the car. You've done nothing wrong, Helen. You're just protecting your life. For the first time in weeks, I believed I could move forward, not with fear, but with a sense of preparation. The meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon. Laura called the day before. Her voice was gentle but carried a sense of urgency. Tomorrow we'll stop by for a bit, Mom. There are some documents we'd like to explain more clearly, so you don't have to worry so much. I agreed. I told her I would be home all day. That morning I tidied the living room as usual. I brewed a pot of tea and set it on the table. The small notebook I used to keep track of conversations was placed in my coat pocket, along with my fully charged phone. I didn't feel like I was preparing for a confrontation. I simply felt that I was doing exactly what Thomas had advised. They arrived right on time. Laura walked in first, carrying a large briefcase. Daniel followed, looking tense. The man with them was Mark, the notary I had met before. He smiled politely and nodded at me, as if this were just an ordinary visit. Laura set the briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside was a neatly arranged stack of documents. Don't worry, Mom. Everything has already been prepared. We just need you to read through and sign in a few places. Daniel sat down across from me. He avoided my eyes, gripping his car keys tightly. Just listen to us first, Mom. Laura began to explain. Her voice was slow and precise, every sentence sounding perfectly reasonable. Selling the house to reduce the burden, putting the money into a joint account for easier management, moving to a care facility with doctors, activities, and better safety for older people. I nodded without interrupting. I asked a few simple questions. If I sell the house, where will I live? What if I don't adjust well to the new place? If I want to change my mind later, will that be possible? Laura smiled and answered each question smoothly. Don't worry, everything is for your benefit. Mark, the notary, took out his stamp and pen. We just need you to sign here, here, and here. It's a very quick process. I looked at the lines in front of me, many terms I wasn't familiar with. I reached out, then pulled my hand back, pretending to hesitate. Could you give me a little more time? I'm feeling a bit tired. Daniel leaned toward me. Mom, we're only doing this because we care about you. Once you sign, you'll feel relieved. I looked at my son. In that moment, I saw again the little boy who used to stand in front of me whenever he knew he had done something wrong. But this time, he couldn't say what he honestly thought. I sighed. Why don't we go through each page together? I want to understand everything clearly. Laura glanced quickly at Mark. He nodded, but I noticed the impatience in their eyes. I began reading slowly, very slowly. I asked them to repeat what they had said. I let time pass. Just then, the doorbell rang. Laura startled. Mark frowned. Daniel turned to look at me. Are you expecting someone, Mom? I stood up calmly. Yes, I am. When I opened the door, Margaret was standing there. Beside her was Thomas Reed, my lawyer. With them was a younger man who introduced himself as an independent legal representative, present at my request. Thomas stepped into the living room, his eyes quickly scanning the table of documents. Hello, everyone. I am the attorney representing Mrs. Helen. The room fell utterly silent. Mark stood up, visibly unsettled. Laura instinctively closed the briefcase. Thomas continued, his tone calm. We're here to ensure that all procedures today are transparent and voluntary. I returned to the table, brought out the small safe from the bedroom, and set it down in front of everyone. I opened it and took out the envelope of documents I had prepared. Inside were the papers for the agricultural land my husband had left me. I slid the documents toward Thomas. He reviewed them briefly, then looked up. According to these records, Mrs. Helen is the legal owner of the land in the eastern part of the state. Its value is sufficient for her to live independently without transferring financial control to anyone. Laura froze. Daniel stared at the papers as if seeing them for the first time. I spoke, not loudly, but clearly. I am not poor. I have not lost the ability to make decisions, and I have never agreed to sell my house or move anywhere. Mark awkwardly gathered his documents. There may have been a misunderstanding. Thomas looked directly at him. We will need to review everything that has been proposed today. Laura opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. Daniel lowered his head. In that moment, I didn't feel like I had won. I simply felt that the truth had been placed on the table, with nothing left hidden. Any scheme, if there had been one, no longer had a place in that room. After all the documents were gathered up, a heavy silence settled over the room. No one spoke anymore about signing papers or moving houses. The gentle words from earlier gave way to the real emotions everyone had been trying to hide. Laura was the one who changed most visibly. The calm expression she usually wore was gone. Her eyes flicked quickly over the stack of papers on the table, then stopped on me, unable to hide her disappointment. Not disappointment because the plan had failed, but because everything had slipped beyond her control. She stood up, packed away the briefcase, and didn't say another word. The concern and care she had shown earlier were nowhere to be found. Daniel remained seated. His head was lowered, his hands clasped together. I could clearly see the confusion in his posture. When he looked up at me, his eyes quickly turned away. "Mom, I didn't think things would turn out like this." His voice was soft, uncertain. I didn't scold him. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at my son for a long time. "I understand that you want what's best," I said slowly, "but what's best for me cannot be decided without asking me." Daniel nodded, his face flushing. He didn't argue. Perhaps for the first time, he realized the boundary he had crossed. I turned to Laura. "I don't oppose you caring about me, but from now on, any decision related to my life and my assets will be mine to make. If I need help, I will say so." Laura didn't respond. She only gave a slight nod, then stood up and said they should leave. Her voice no longer carried the earlier softness. As they were heading toward the door, I called out to Daniel, "Could you stay and talk with me for a moment?" Daniel hesitated and looked at Laura. She didn't say anything, just put on her coat and stepped outside first. We stayed behind in the living room. Thomas and Margaret also stood up and left the space to the two of us. Daniel sat across from me, looking directly into my eyes for the first time since he had arrived. "Mom, I really thought I was helping you." I nodded. "I believe you, but loving. Someone doesn't mean making every decision for them." He sighed and covered his face with his hand. I didn't force him to apologize. I didn't need that at the time. I just needed him to understand. I made my boundaries clear. I would not sell my house under pressure. I would not sign documents I didn't fully understand, and I would not accept being treated as someone incapable of living her own life. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When he stood up to leave, he hugged me longer than usual, not rushed, not perfunctory. I knew our relationship couldn't return to what it once was, but at least something important had been said. And sometimes, preserving a connection, even a fragile one, is better than letting it wither away in silence. The days that followed passed more slowly than I expected. There were no calls from Laura. Daniel didn't reach out right away either. I didn't contact him. I needed time for things to settle, and I believed my son did too. A week later, one late afternoon, I heard a car stop in front of the house. When I looked out the window, I saw Daniel standing in the yard. He was alone. I opened the door. Daniel stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking awkward. "Are you free, Mom? I'd like to talk for a bit." I nodded and invited him in. We sat across from each other in the living room, just as we had many times before. I made tea and set it on the table. Neither of us rushed to speak. Daniel was the first to speak. "I've been thinking a lot these past few days." I didn't interrupt. I let him continue. He said he hadn't realized he was repeating Laura's words without thinking them through. He said he was afraid of upsetting Laura, afraid of conflict in his new marriage. He didn't say he regretted it, but I heard the exhaustion in his voice. I didn't blame him. I didn't revisit what had happened. I said only one thing. I don't need you to take my side or anyone else's. I just need you to respect my decisions." Daniel nodded. "I understand." After that, Daniel still came by, but not often. Each visit was brief. We discussed simple things, the weather, work, and meals. No one mentioned houses or money. I realized that sometimes healing doesn't come from long conversations. It comes from not hurting each other and knowing when to stop. Once, before leaving, Daniel paused at the door. "Mom, if you ever need anything, just tell me." I smiled. "When I need it, I will." There were no grand promises, no binding commitments, just a new, quiet understanding taking shape. I knew trust couldn't return overnight, but Daniel coming back on his own, his willingness to listen, those were changes. And for me, that was enough to begin again, slowly but steadily. As time passed, things gradually settled into a new rhythm. Not like before, but not as heavy as I had once feared. I learned to slow down, listen to myself more, and stop rushing to fill emptiness with old expectations. Daniel continued to visit, always on his own. He didn't mention Laura much. I didn't ask either. Some things, when we're not ready, are better left untouched. We kept our meetings simple, just enough to avoid exhausting each other. I continued caring for the small garden behind the house. I cooked for myself, not waiting for anyone to come home, but because I liked keeping the kitchen warm. I began spending time reading, taking morning walks, and joining a neighborhood activity group for older adults. Through Margaret, I learned that Laura and Daniel were having many conflicts, not because of me, but because of differences Daniel had previously tried to ignore. I felt neither happy nor sad hearing that. I understood that when one person learns to set boundaries, the relationships around them are also forced to change. One afternoon, Daniel stayed longer than usual. As we drank tea, he said slowly, "Mom, I think I used to see you only as my mother, not as someone with her own life." I looked at him. "Now you do." He nodded, his expression softer. I didn't need further apologies. I believe real change isn't in words, but in how someone treats you from that point on. I didn't cut Laura out of my life. When she texted to check in, I still replied, briefly, politely. Not warm, but not cold either. I understand now that forgiveness doesn't mean going back to how things were. Forgiveness is about freeing your own heart from resentment. Family, to me, is no longer a place where everything must be endured to keep the peace. Family is where each person is respected, heard, and allowed to live according to their stage of life. I often think about my late husband. If he were still alive, he probably wouldn't say much. He would simply smile, the way he always did when I stood up to protect myself. Now I understand something very clearly. Older people don't need pity. We need to be trusted. We need to be asked, and we need to be loved with respect, not control. Forgiveness, when placed in the proper context, can change people. But boundaries are what keep family bonds from being hurt again. I am still a mother. However, I am also a woman with my own life, my own choices, and my own worth. And at this age, I want nothing more than to live peaceful days within a family that knows when to stop, so that love can exist in the right way.